My name is Harish Pillay, and I'm part of the Open Source Program Office for Asia Pacific. I head it up, and we're part of the Office of the CTO, the OCTO. For today's session, I'm going to be touching on a few thinking processes and ideas around what does it mean to consume open source projects versus open source products, and what are the nuances that you have to be aware of as an organization doing either or both of it. So we'll quickly try to cover a few things in the time that I have, talking about open source projects versus open source products, to understand the notion of consuming either one or both, and some of the impact in terms of development, because when you are consuming a project, you have different considerations. When you're consuming a product, you have different considerations. If there is one slide that I would like you to take back from here, in addition to the slides that my colleagues would also share with you, is this one slide. That an open source project is not the same as an open source product. I'll repeat myself. Open source project is not the same as an open source product. What does that mean? An open source product in this chart is labeled here as a downstream product. An open source project, on the other hand, is labeled here as an upstream project. What do these two qualifiers indicate, an upstream and a downstream? An upstream is where things are happening in a fairly rapid pace. Things that are not necessarily driven, most likely they are not driven at all by commercial considerations. It is just a bunch of people, organizations coming together to solve a problem. It's upstream. Whereas a downstream product is productizing what has been happening upstream in the projects to be able to be consumed by entities that have got no time or inclination or interest in engaging with the community and the open source project. Not that they cannot do it, but they can, and they choose sometimes not to do so, and that's entirely their prerogative. So that's the two columns here. Let me just walk you through three aspects around these two columns. The first one is around commercial relationships. What does that mean? A customer, in the case of an open source project, a customer and the community, and let's say, for example, Red Hat as a member of the community, we are working together for a common good. It is not for the common good of the customer in this case. It's the common good for everybody. It may end up being good for the customer, but that's not the primary focus. A customer may have a problem and is trying to fix it, and the community steps in trying to see what can be done. And ultimately, the customer benefits from it, so does the rest of the community. But that's not a primary focus. Because this relationship is not within commercially defined terms. It is best efforts. Let's see how we can work on this together and make something good out of it. When you look at the product, on the other hand, when you consume a product from an entity, in the case of Red Hat, you consume OpenShift, for example, from Red Hat. We have a relationship with you, a service level agreement, and a whole suite of different aspects around what a product is meant to be to you as an enterprise. And so that changes how we engage. We will still engage you as equals, but now we have an added responsibility to be answerable to you if something breaks, something needs to be fixed, something needs to be updated, something needs to be added. We have a commercial relationship and an agreement in place to make sure this is working for you. We are not therefore answerable to the rest of the community. It is just you and us. That's it. Let's look at the second point here about the ecosystem. In a project, the ecosystem essentially says that you, the consumer of this particular project, you're answerable for yourself. If you have a problem, you try and figure out what to do. You have interest in integrating with these other products from other parties, other third parties. That's up to you. Please go ahead. You're empowered to do so. Please do so. If you need help, maybe the third-party provider can help, maybe not. Or perhaps somebody else in the community may have experience in that, and they can probably help. or even Red Hat for that matter, may be able to help. But we have no obligations, no service level agreement, no commercial arrangement from that perspective to be able to make it reach a conclusion and a goal and an endpoint which is acceptable to everybody. You're really on your own, and let's work together. It can happen. Many organizations have done that, but it does take on a lot more other responsibilities on the part of the organization, which is not, this is a non-trivial exercise. In the case of a downstream product, for example, OpenShift, we are answerable to you and also all the other partners that we work with to make sure that their products and services work well on our environment. Plus, it benefits you, and vice versa. So we are custodian on this, about this particular product, and we work with everybody and anyone who needs to be part of the story so that everybody benefits from it. We have a commercial interest in it, a motivation that generates opportunities for different people to be participant in it. So that's an ecosystem. So two different types of ecosystems. The last one is about trade-offs. Now, this is where a lot of organizations trip over themselves because they don't fully appreciate it until they are into a particular project, consuming a particular project for that matter. What happens when you try to get engaged in an open source project, which is fairly complex? You are trading the cost of bringing a party who is fully empowered to make it work and work as well as it can possibly be. Instead, you are now having to deal with making sure that your own people are able to take on the roles and responsibilities and build the skill sets and the knowledge and the experience to make all of this work together in a complex project. A simple project, yeah, I guess it's no big deal. But a complex project, for example, OKD, it's a very, very complex project. It's non-trivial. And you have to put in the additional brain power and skill sets development to make it successful for yourself. That's not easy. On the other hand, when you do a product, if OpenShift is an example, we are answerable to you. We work with you to make sure things are working fine. We handle all the million different moving parts to make sure that this set of tools that work together, the gears and the bells and whistles, work for you. Big difference. And this is a graphical example of what that means. Fedora and OKD on the left side, these are open source projects. And on the right-hand side, open source products. You can certainly run Fedora in your data center. Sure, of course you can run it. Absolutely fine. But you have to worry about making sure if there's issues, you have to worry about making sure you manage the security, bug fixes, upgrades, updates, whatever that comes down the line. It's really up to you. You have to manage that. Likewise, for OKD, you can certainly deploy it. By all means, please do so. But be aware and keep your eyes open and ears open that there will be challenges that you may not necessarily be able to fix because you are not engaged in it 100% of the time with the global community. On the other hand, on the other side, on the right-hand side, you see the products that come out of Fedora and OKD. In this case, Red Hat Enterprise Linux and Red Hat OpenShift Container Platform. This, you engage with the entity Red Hat, and we are accountable to you across the entire spectrum of this. As long as you're a customer of ours, you have the subscription in place and all the necessary arrangements there, we are answerable to you, make sure that you are successful all the time. I hope this gives you a sense of the distinction between a project and a product. There are people who, unfortunately, do not fully appreciate the notion of what open source means. A lot of organizations and individuals, and it's no fault of theirs, it's just a terminology. We have been doing this for a very long time. Open source is not a business model. That's not how you figure out that you can make a business and a revenue out of it. No. Open source is all about trying to figure out how I can make something happen. Just because it's open source doesn't mean it's going to happen. And in this slide, you see step 1, open source, step 2, something, and hopefully step 3, you make a profit out of it. however it might be. It doesn't really matter where it is, but these 3 steps. Step 2 is the tricky one, because that is hard to do. Red Hat was in that position in the year 2000, 2001, until we figured out that open source is not the business model. Open source is essentially a development model and also a distribution model. I repeat, open source is a development model and also a distribution model. So what does the development here mean? It enables collaboration with others. Remember the open source projects that you can work with the community? That's exactly what you can do. You can enable collaboration with others. You connect you with the talents outside the organization. So within your organization, you have your best engineers who can do fantastic stuff. But there will definitely be challenges, definitely be areas that you may not have in-house skill sets. How can you reach out to external people to do that? You can certainly have a contractual agreement with somebody or work with the open source community. It does lower the cost of a lot of things that you want to do. You can reuse the code. You have the ability to repurpose and refactor the code that you're using from the open source community to do whatever you want to do instead of starting from fresh. That is a significant change, but it is a change that has got other implications as well. When you look at the distribution of what has been created, so in the case of, sorry, let me just go back. In the case of OKD, for example, OKD allows people to try, what is this thing called Kubernetes? What does that actually mean? How can I even make it work? What are the different bells and whistles in it? What are the different wheels and the gears and what have you? How does it work? What are the things that I need to understand? There's a lot of learning and lessons that you have to learn. It also gives you an opportunity, in the case of an open source project, to influence the market. So the mere fact that some of you in the audience are looking at OKD as a learning tool, it achieves the second part, which is influencing the market. The marketplace say, yeah, this is something that we want to do, want to try. But whether you want to deploy in a production environment, that's a different conversation. So let me do a quick economics of 101. We all know economics, those of you who have studied economics, that when the price of a particular good or service decreases, the demand for the good or service will increase. It's no-brainer, right? But what does this mean from an open source perspective? Open source can reduce significantly the cost of acquisition, and you can also maximize the demand for it, because you don't have to open up a purchase order to get something. You just go ahead and download and try and use. And if it works for you, good for you. If you can then keep it sustainable, if you can deploy in production, so much the better. But ultimately, you have to manage all of the pieces, all of the different components along the way. There's also another aspect. When the price goes down, the demand for substitutes also decreases. So the people who say, hey, I can substitute this particular product with the other one with my product, but the cost is so much lower, it's sometimes harder for the consumer to say, well, this is a bit cheaper, next to almost zero, I can get to it. The other one, I have to go through a different process. So there is a different dynamic that happens, and it reduces the substitutes. These are all economics 101. So if you have studied economics before, this would be something that you probably hark back to your days in school. And also, when the price of a particular good or services decreases, the demand for its complements increase. What does that mean? It means there are surrounding app services and solutions that can then make this particular product or good better, adds additional functionality, services, and so on. So what are the implications? As a consumer operator consideration, what are the implications? You are both a consumer and an operator. You could be consuming OKD. Do you want to operate OKD in a production environment? You're empowered to do so. But is that really what you want to do? Because the first bullet point here, building up and sustaining in-house skills and expertise becomes a serious consideration. Do you have ability to sustain it? You may also want to acquire third-party products and services. it is really up to you to make them interoperable and integratable with OKD, for example. What about ongoing support for production? And what about the development code trees? Are they going to be the same, one and the same? Probably they're going to be one and the same, but you may have a different tag on it to make sure that the ones that are tagged as production and stable are the ones that are being deployed, and the ones that are development are not. So there's a lot more work that you need to do and put in place and make sure that you don't have a scenario where this becomes a challenge because you may not have in-house skill sets. This is an ongoing problem across the world. It's nothing unique to you as an organization. It is, everybody faces it. So we have to work with who we can to make sure that we are successful across the system. So with that, if you frame the strategy of how you consume open source software and open source products and services, we need to understand, and you need to also appreciate for yourself, who will download and use these open source projects or products. Is it your organization, your developer team only? Once your developer team takes it, you give it to your deployment team and a productions team. Who will consume the commercial open source product? Is it your production team or yourself? What are the challenges of the audience? Can you sustain the engineers that you need? Can you sustain the ability and the skill sets? Are you able to understand and incorporate issues that may come up in the products? The code may have some issues that you need to fix. Are you able to do that? Do you have a bug tracking system, a vulnerability tracking system? These are all things that you need to look at and understand and manage. It's a whole exercise that us as a commercial provider of open source products do that for you. Okay. So in order to be successful in deploying open source products, an open source project has to be successful as well. Do you want to be part of the bigger picture of OKD? I would encourage you to be. Please, we welcome as much participation as possible. By the end of the day, if you're going to be also if you're only going to be deploying the project for your production purposes, you are taking on a lot more work and a lot more responsibilities that we are already doing. In other words, we are answerable to you if you have an arrangement with us so that we can manage the product side of the house. And while we also are working together, collaborating on the project side of the house. All right, with that, I will end my session here, and I'm happy to take questions later on. Thank you. Before I go, just some additional resources that I will make available through my colleagues. And this is it. Thank you very much.